Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Republican Senate primary out of the state of Pennsylvania, which is only 10 days away now. It coincides with the Democratic primary. I made a video on the Democratic primary yesterday. If you want to go see it, there'll be a link to it at the end of this video. But we'll get right into it because this is one of the more contentious primaries with there's really no clear frontrunner, although Oz is up. He's only up by 2.5 points. So we'll go into the polling now, but this race has changed a lot in the past year or so because originally Sean Parnell was the Trump endorsed candidate. Oz wasn't even in the race. I don't know if McCormick was. He might have been. You had Carlos Sands was in the race since the beginning, but you had a lot less competition. Parnell had a strong lead in all of these polls leading up to, of course, him dropping out of the race. Now, he was, the nominee for Connor Lamb's district, the Republican nominee back in 2020. He lost, but he overperformed Trump's margin, getting about 49% of the vote. So he almost won that race there. And he was a favorite among the MAGA Trump base of the Republican Party. But he had to drop out due to marital issues he was having. There were allegations of abuse, things like that. So he ended up dropping out of the race. And it kind of blew the primary wide open because Dr. Oz shortly after joined into the race. David McCormick starts to be known in the race. And his poll numbers were pretty high. I mean, he was getting high teens, low 20s, and I think mainly that's because he blanketed the airways with attack ads on Dr. Oz. Now, Dr. Oz and McCormick have been going back and forth because they're the two front runners in this race up until recently, in which you had Kathy Barnette kind of make a last-minute surge, although we'll see how the newest polls are, but she seems to be surging at the moment as a last-minute contender, potentially for third place, and we'll talk about her later on in the video. Jeff Bartos, the other candidate in this race, was the lieutenant gubernatorial nominee, the lieutenant governor's nominee back in 2018, although he really failed to gain any traction. Although, to be honest, from watching the debates, I think he did exceptionally well at articulating his points and policy positions, but unfortunately for him, he's not really gained any real traction in this primary. And of course, you have Carla Sands. Similar thing, she's just running kind of as the more establishment conservative. She obviously backs Trump, but she really hasn't been able to gain a whole lot of steam either. She was Trump's ambassador to like the Netherlands or something like that. And she really hasn't gone anywhere. So it's really between Oz and McCormick and potentially Barnette when we see what the latest polls are. And again, in the aggregate, Oz is only up 2.5% despite having Trump's endorsement. Trump endorsed him a few weeks ago, and since then, he's been leading in the polls, but not by a whole lot. And these polls have a lot of undecideds. 43% undecided is a huge amount. 17, 39. So this primary really could go either way. Now, the last time this seat was up for election was back in 2016 with incumbent Republican Pat Toomey. Donald Trump won the state of Pennsylvania in this election by 0.7%, and Toomey was able to win this race by about 1.5%. So he overperformed Trump about by a point or so in this race, almost a point. And he did better in the suburban counties around Philadelphia and the northeastern part of Pennsylvania over Donald Trump. A lot of the Republican voters who voted for Trump in rural Pennsylvania, a big chunk of them, as high as 7 or 8%, voted for the Libertarian candidate. And that's because Toomey was a more liberal on issues like guns and a few other social positions. He was a bit more moderate. So a lot of these rural, more conservative voters ended up voting Libertarian, but it didn't really affect the race very much. Pat Toomey still ended up winning by 1.5%. Now Pat Toomey is not running for re-election, and there's no clear frontrunner in this primary. I would say Oz is the narrow frontrunner and the narrow favorite to win the primary, but we're still 10 days out, and I'm not going to release my official prediction on this race until about a day or two before, because it really is going down to the wire here. David McCormick is a rich CEO hedge fund manager. He's been bankrolling a lot of his own campaign. Obviously, he's had some grassroots support, but most of his funding is coming from big donors and, of course, his own pocket. And it's paid off for him. He's been getting low 20s, high teens, which in this sort of primary with a lot of contenders is pretty good. McCormick and Oz have really been going at it a lot. And this is another thing I want to highlight because there's a big segment of the Trump base that is not happy with Trump's endorsement of Dr. Oz. And because Dr. Oz has held some pretty socially liberal positions in the past, even the recent past, like the past 2 years on issues like abortion, other culture war issues, things like that. He's been pretty liberal, to say the least. And he's been a registered Republican, mind you, his entire life, or at least as long as I could remember. So it wasn't that he was a Democrat becoming a Republican. David McCormick, on the other hand, his record is probably just like Dr. Oz's. He had some pretty liberal social positions, again, on things like transgender issues, Black Lives Matter, things like that, while he was CEO, which is something that Oz has been attacking him on, although Oz really hasn't attacked McCormick on that as much as I think he should have, given that this is a Republican primary, and that is kind of a red flag for a lot of Republican voters. McCormick was part of the Bush administration. I think he was some Treasury Secretary or he was in some financial position. And, he kind of did a 180 just like Dr. Oz did. Both of them did a 180 on these positions. They've been turning back. Both of their ads have accused the other candidate of being woke, things like that, talking about transgender issues, immigration. McCormick has a record of shipping jobs overseas, which is something Oz has highlighted, which I think is pretty effective. But neither of these candidates from a Republican-based perspective are really ideal. And that's why I think you're seeing a last-minute surge from Kathy Barnette. She's not Trump-endorsed, but she's tied herself to Trump very strongly in a lot of her ads, a lot of her policies. She's given Trump credit in nearly all of her videos. She talks about Donald Trump and the election. She failed to get Trump's endorsement, and it makes sense. Dr. Oz is a personal friend of Donald Trump's. He's rich. He has high name recognition. Trump wants to endorse a candidate that he thinks can win the primary and win the general. And I guess he didn't really see anything much in Kathy Barnette. But I think for Trump, once Oz jumped into the race, it was a done deal. David McCormick has a very interesting history with Trump because I think he was an anti-Trump Republican up and until he decided to run for Senate. So he's a very disingenuous sort of candidate from a Republican-based perspective. He didn't like Trump for the vast majority of his term in office until after he left office and decided to run for Senate. David McCormick decided that he liked the former president. So, it really is down to these two. And again, we could take a look at the other candidates because I want to highlight them as well. Jeff Bartos, I think, would have had a much easier time in this primary had Oz not jumped in, if it was just McCormick, potentially. But again, even before Oz jumps in, he's not even leading Kathy Barnette in the original. He was the former lieutenant gubernatorial nominee for the Republicans, and we talked about that before, but he won the primary by a sound amount, 46.8% of the vote. Now, granted, 2018 was not really a year that the Republicans were expected to do well. Tom Wolf was a very popular incumbent governor. He ended up winning this election by about 17 points. So you could say that the Wagner Bartos ticket was sort of a sacrificial lamb ticket since they really didn't have a chance in the general election. But Bartos had strong support throughout eastern Pennsylvania, and I'm assuming he's from eastern Pennsylvania. I think he is. I think he's from Reading, somewhere in that area now. But, he had a record of creating businesses in his business career as well, just like McCormick did. McCormick created jobs, but of course the big criticism of his is that he outsourced. Kathy Barnette, talking about her real quick, again, has been trying to tie herself to Donald Trump. She ran for the House back in the 2020 elections and ended up losing by about 19 percentage points. Now, she did run in a safe blue district, and she did overperform Trump, but she lost by a considerable amount. Now, something Barnette has done that I don't really think is good strategy at all, to say the least, is that she said that she lost this race because of a rigged election, because the election was stolen from her, but that's kind of a laughable claim when you look at the margin and the other facts of the matter. So even Carla Sands during the debate attacked her on that. So I don't really think that's a good strategy. Definitely a terrible strategy for the general election for any Republican nominee. But nonetheless, she is surging among the Trump base because she doesn't have these skeletons in her closet. She doesn't have these past socially liberal positions, these outsourcing deals, a questionable medical career. So, Kathy Barnette, through the eyes of the Trump base, is a safer option in terms of policy. However, in terms of electability, she's probably more toward the bottom since she runs considerably to the right, so she could risk this seat in a general election, although I will say Fetterman, the likely Democratic nominee, has run very far to the left on the political spectrum as well. So that would be a really interesting matchup between the two of them. But Oz and McCormick really do seem to be the two frontrunners, and you'd think Oz would be doing better after the Trump endorsement. We can look back at the Ohio primary for perspective. J.D. Vance, once he got his endorsement from Donald Trump, was doing a lot better in the latest run-up to the polls, to the point where he ended up leading the polling aggregate. He wasn't in the lead before. Josh Mandel was in the lead for the longest time. Josh Mandel had landslide margins in the primary up until recently. Once Trump endorsed J.D. Vance, everything flipped on a dime, and he started leading in all the polls. Matt Dolan had a little bit of a surge at the end among the establishment, never Trump wing of the Republican Party, and potentially even some Democrats. But ultimately, it wasn't really enough to get him anywhere again. And it is impressive. He went from going down to 2, 1, 3%, all the way up to 22% at the end. And in the final vote total, he was able to secure 23% of the vote. So he overperformed his polling aggregate a tiny bit. Now, Oz, we're not seeing the same rallying behind Oz. Again, J.D. Vance did have a questionable history as well. He once compared Trump to Hitler. Trump seemed to look past that, and, he's since become a very pro-Trump candidate. And as a result, he ended up winning the primary by about 10 points. So, 9 points, rather. So he did considerably well. This was Mandel's race to lose. Mandel, in some cases, was getting 40% of the primary vote until this endorsement. Obviously, things got a little bit more contentious toward the end, but ultimately, Mandel floundered, and he floundered because Trump endorsed J.D. Vance and not him. That's the main reason. I guarantee you, if Mandel had Trump's endorsement, he would have won this primary. He probably would have done worse in the general election, given he wasn't really a good candidate, objectively speaking. He had temperament issues. He was kind of immature, things like that. He came off as a very phony sort of candidate. So I think he would have had a lot of trouble gaining traction in a general election. Although a state as red as Ohio during 2022, an expected red wave year, probably going to go red anyway, even with Mandel, but it would have been a lot closer of a race. J.D. Vance kind of made Ohio more of a layup. So, looking at Pennsylvania, we'll have to see if those results translate. The primary is in less than 10 days. So we're really not going to know what the effect of this is until after this video, which is why I'm not releasing my final prediction on the state of Pennsylvania's Republican primary until the day before, probably. I probably won't release a video until right up until the primary, because it's going to go right down to the wire, I think. And this is going to be a closer primary, unless Dr. Oz really gobbles up these undecided voters. But, the PA GOP kind of screwed up with a lot of the primary candidates, both on the gubernatorial level and on the Senate. I'll probably make a separate video on why Pennsylvania could be a unique pickup for the Democrats in both races, because the Republican Party has really messed up every step of the way. They don't really have exceptionally strong general election candidates on either side. On the gubernatorial level, you have Mastriano surging over Barletta, and Mastriano I don't really think is an electable candidate, and we'll talk about that in another video. But the Republican Party as a whole in Pennsylvania really dropped the ball. This doesn't mean they're going to lose this race. They still have the advantage given the year, but they don't really have a solid nominee to get behind as of right now, either in this race or the governor's election. And that's really going to hurt you, because Shapiro's already the governor's nominee for the Democrats. Fetterman is basically a shoo-in for the Senate nomination there. So it's a much more compact field. The Republican primary is a lot more chaotic and all over the place. I think Trump's endorsement of Oz earlier on in this campaign would have helped a lot more, considering Oz would have probably had a more sizable lead. Trump probably could have done more rallies in the state of Pennsylvania. For Oz, he did one yesterday, and he might do maybe another or so to get Oz over the finish line. As it stands right now, I do think Oz will end up being the nominee. I think it's going to be close with McCormick, but I do think Oz is going to overperform the polls a tad bit, since I think you're going to have undecideds break for him since he's Trump endorsed, like they did for J.D. Vance in the state of Ohio. So ultimately, I think Oz has an edge here right now. I think McCormick will come in second. Or potentially Barnette might come in second. She's a very interesting candidate, like I said, and, she might end up being the second place. It's unlikely right now, but if her surge kind of continues here, she might end up being a second place contender. Again, she's extremely popular with the furthest right portion of the Trump America First base. You have the base backing Oz to an extent reluctantly, but you have a decent chunk of them also backing Barnette. So it's going to be a really interesting dynamic that plays out on primary day. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification down below if you're new and you want to get updates on my content. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.